welcome. It is so nice to see people in person again. And we've had a couple of story times here in person, but this is our first real launch for a non-picture book. So we're incredibly excited to have you all here, and I'm especially excited that it is for Rebecca's book. If you don't know Rebecca is one of the most generous people in our community. Ever since we opened the bookstore back in 2018, Rebecca has been leading our middle grade book club. And
some of whom are here.
Some of whom are here, yep. Very excited to have these guys here tonight. And just out of the goodness of her heart, just every month, even if there's only a couple of people that come for book club, she's always here. So we try to do as much as we can to support her in turn. And so really just thrilled that this is our first real event. And thank you all for being here. The book we're celebrating tonight is Worst Case Colin. It is Rebecca's third book, all for middle grade readers. All three of her books are over there, but this is when I met Rebecca, this was the one that really had spoken to her, and it's been a long time coming. So we're really excited to have her and Rajani. If you don't know Rajani, just go buy a copy of the Boston Globe.
She has 6 books out this year.
6 books out this year, and the Globe last weekend did a big profile on her that you should absolutely go check out. Now, I'm not big on long introductions, so I'm going to turn the floor over to them, but please give them a round of applause.
So, Rebecca, I'm so excited to be here with you for an in-person event. It just feels like we needed this. We really did. And I have to tell you that I love this book so much. So much. Like, when you have to read a book, you're like, I'm going to read this book. But then you sit down and you get so lost in it that you don't want to do anything else. Like, literally, I think my husband was watching something on the TV and I was like, no, I'm going to be over there reading this book. So just like, you do whatever you want to do, but I'm going to be doing this. It's so incredibly beautifully written. I love the characters. I love Colin, like from page 1, and I love all the characters. So can you tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for joining me. You're one of my author superstars. We kind of come to publishing in similar times along this journey, and it's just so exciting to see how prolific you are. I'm so happy to chat with you, and thank you to Silver Unicorn and everybody here for joining us. Just so grateful. But yeah, this book. So Worst Case Colin is the story of a 12-year-old boy who is fixated on preparing for every worst-case scenario possible, everything from avalanche to riptide. And he has this worst-case scenario handbook that he carries around, and he memorizes every chapter in this handbook. And this is because a few years prior, he lost his mother in a fluke accident, and he can't help but wonder what would have happened differently had someone been better prepared. And so he takes it upon himself to be prepared for everything, which means, he's dealing with a lot of anxiety. Meanwhile, Colin's father, he's a loving parent, and he's a gifted mathematician, but he copes with their loss in a very different way. He struggles with compulsive hoarding disorder, and so he begins to collect more and more things inside their home. And soon, Colin realizes that he is sort of living one of these worst-case scenarios, but one that doesn't necessarily come with an easy escape plan, one that doesn't come with an instruction manual. And so he has to learn how to not just survive the situation at home and some issues at school, but how to thrive. So, and in terms of your question, what inspired the book? So, about 6 years ago, I went to an SCBWI conference, which is the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. They have a wonderful New England branch, and that year the keynote speaker was Kwame Alexander, who wrote The Crossover. And The Crossover had just won the Newbery Prize at that point, and I admittedly had not yet read that book. It was a novel, it is a novel in verse about a boy who plays basketball, and it hadn't piqued my interest. But then I heard Kwame speak, and he's so charismatic and so bright and engaging, and he had such a passion for poetry, and he talked about its potential to touch young readers in particular. And so I immediately ran to the bookstore and grabbed The Crossover and kind of devoured that book, and I was just blown away by, do with such a economy of words, the rhythm of that book, and so that led me down this rabbit hole of verse novels. I just kind of tried to get my hands on whatever I could, and this voice for Colin kind of emerged out of that verse novel foray, I guess.
Interesting. So this was always a novel in verse. That's how you thought about
right
it.
from the get-go. I think because I was reading so much in this format that when Colin's kind of voice and story came, it just made sense. The other thing that I loved about that form for this book as opposed to prose, which is a lot heavier, was that, one of the things Colin wants is breathing. Right? He's just like, his house is so claustrophobic and cluttered, and all he wants is like the space kind of figuratively and literally to sort of breathe. And like the white space on the page, you'll see it's in verse, so it's told through a series of poems with a narrative thread. It's free verse, so there's not like a rhyme to it. But there's a lot of white space in the page, which kind of reinforces Colin's desire for that.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Do you mind reading this?
Sure, I can read it. Can you guys hear okay? I feel like I'm yelling. Sort of? Not really? Okay.
You could be louder.
Louder? Okay. Sorry if I'm yelling right now.
No, it's fine. I will also yell.
I'll project that way. So like I said, Colin's father is a mathematician. There are many kind of threads and themes woven through the book, and one of them is numbers, and one of them specifically is prime numbers, and this idea of being indivisible. And his father has a fixation on prime numbers, and so there are poems that relate to kind of this mathematical theme throughout the book. So this is one called 2. It's number 2. And it's written in couplets and broken couplets, kind of playing on that poetic form, also reinforcing this idea of 2. So 2. 2 is a prime number. 2 is the number of years that have passed since before became after. 2 is the number of cars that collided on the bridge. 2 is the number of states separated by the river that runs under the bridge. 2 is the number of minutes it took emergency responders to break the window. 2 is too many. 2 is the number of people left in our home now that Mom is gone. 2 is not enough.
So powerful.
You have a poem called 2 in your book too, don't
I
you?
do. It's the first
Our
poem.
books actually
in my book,
have
yes.
a lot of parallels. She has the most beautiful poem in your book is called, I think, it's called The River. And there's a river in my book, and in her book, the river refers to many things, and blood being one of them. And there's some interesting parallels, which is why I thought it was fun to chat.
Yeah. So I'm just going to ask you some. So I'm going to ask a nerdy writing question. So when you first, so I understand that you were reading verse novels and you got inspired and you heard Colin's voice in your head. How much of the plot of this novel did you know before you started to write it?
So she's asking about the plot, and maybe you couldn't hear. So I notoriously write quiet books, which often are not driven by the plot. It's more of an internal element with my characters, and that's what's interesting to me. But my editors and my agent keep telling me that a book needs a plot. Darn it.
Usually a novel is
So the plot came about kind of organically, and I have to admit, I actually wrote this book completely out of order. I didn't write it in a chronological way, and in fact, during revision, it got reordered even more. So I kind of knew the end point. Oh, thank you. Our book club. We're in the same book. How do we get over there? You'll be photos later. I'm not cool. Marcia, you're so cute. I didn't even make our meeting last night. This is for our book club. We're so proud to have our book. We're thrilled. We authored it. We're so proud
it, Clyde. Yes.
See, it's hard. I lost it.
Exactly.
They are a plot
Very
twist.
pleasant plot twist. It was good.
Yeah, so I knew kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end, like in my mind, like as beats, right? I knew kind of the like some scenes that are sort of the catalyst or in the climax, right?
Yeah.
But everything else around that was sort of like this texture, and those were the poems that I was kind of filling in. And I wrote this in such a disjointed way. Like I said, I started writing it almost 6 years ago when my daughters were really young, and I would only write in these little like 15-minute snippets, and so I would write just one poem at a time, often in the Market Basket parking lot in the front seat of my car while they were in their car seats. So yeah, it was really glamorous. But that also, forced me to write certain things and then rearrange and play with the structure. And so I think knowing those main beats in the plot and then fitting things in and just kind of working with the flow of the story, it came about through revision.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I feel like a lot of verse novelists write poems however they occur to me.
Did you write them all in order?
No.
No.
No. And I knew the general outline of what was going to happen, and then I did some research and realized one of the things I thought was going to happen couldn't happen. So then I was like, okay, got to shift things around a little bit. But yeah, and then I wrote them in whatever order they came into my head, and then later on worried about how I was going to do them.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Caroline Starr Rose, who wrote Maybe, she's a verse novelist as well, historical fiction. She has a quote, she has a passage where she talks about writing a verse novel is like creating a patchwork quilt, and every poem is a different patch. And that's actually how I work. I print out my poems on little quarter-size sheets, like the print is minuscule, and I lay it out. I have pictures of it taking over my entire office floor, and I move the poems around, and I look for, and I kind of color code them too, and I look for the threads and the patterns, and just kind of like massage the form until it has the energy and the momentum and just sort of the patterns that you're looking for.
Yeah. It's so interesting, and I can feel that too. And I feel like a lot of what you're describing is intuitive. Like you just have to like read the poetry, and then you kind of have to figure out what feels right to put next, kind of thing. It's so interesting.
But it can be hard when you're reading something so many times. I was telling you this earlier. When you read your own novel so many times in these draft forms, you lose all objectivity, which is why critique partners, many of whom are in the audience today, are so valuable, because I'll send it to my crit partners and I'll say just give me your impressions of this, or does this make sense, or is this confusing, and you need those other eyes, those fresh eyes on the work. It's so helpful.
Okay, another question. So some of the side characters in this novel are like my favorite characters ever, especially Colin's two best friends. So can you tell me a little bit about how they came about? Was this like something was it like a surprise while you were drafting, or had you thought about all this ahead of time?
So Colin has two best friends, Liam and Georgia. Liam is like the total goofball. He's like a doofus, but he's really lovable, and he always sticks up for Colin. And Georgia becomes sort of this really innocent, crush that Colin has, but is also really supportive. I didn't set out saying, okay, we need these two foils for this character. It was kind of that magical thing that happens when you write, where you almost hear their voice, or you just kind of feel around the story. And I do. Colin needed a support system. He was dealing with a lot in his family life, and I think in a middle grade book, there are definitely some heavier moments in the story, but I think for this age range, like 8 to 14, you need to balance that heaviness always with hope. That's the number one thing, and also levity. And so the friends add that humor. Liam especially. There's times when I laugh out loud when I reread the book. He's just such a goofball, and you need that balance for a book for children, I think, and they offer that.
Absolutely. And then how about writing the bully? There is a bully in this book, and he's pretty awful. And I was like, wow. But you show a different side to this bully too, which I found very interesting. So how did that character come about?
I'm glad you noticed that, because one of my editors told me you can never have, or you can rarely have a really flat, one-dimensional antagonist, right? Your villain needs to be the hero of their own story. And I think about all that all the time. In fact, for the sequel for Mission Multiverse, the villain actually is the hero of the story in that book, because I did a lot of thinking about that antagonistic force, and that they should be multidimensional, right? They have their flaws and their weaknesses, but they're the reason that they're behaving a certain way. And eventually, you go back to layers, and then you see that this boy who's bullying Colin is carrying around things that we don't see, you know, day to day. And it's such a good reminder to kind of lead with empathy and compassion, because even the bully, you know, he has a story, right? There's, you know, who knows what he's really going through. And I was glad that came through. You don't normally sympathize with.
Right, absolutely. And it's not like you're like, oh, that's okay that you did all these horrible things, but you're at least can understand where this kid is coming from. And so I thought that was really fascinating. Okay, I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. About the setting, which is about as different from Massachusetts as you can get. So please tell us about it.
Yeah, the cover and my dress kind of give a hint. It's set in Arizona, in Bullhead City, and it's in a kind of very arid desert landscape. I chose that setting for a couple reasons. One of the things I really was intrigued by was this idea of kind of like broken borders and kind of like the permeability between borders. And Bullhead is right on the Colorado River, and a lot of people who live in Bullhead will commute and kind of cross the border into Nevada every day, and which is what Colin's mom does. And I just thought about this idea of like underwater borders and these in between spaces, and what happens if there's an accident on the bridge leading across this river. Who is responsible? Is it Arizona? Is it Nevada? Who comes in to help, right? And who rescues someone in that situation? So, I also love playing with contrast in this book. You have Colin often goes and kind of seeks refuge in the desert, into this vacant lot where he just finds a lot of peace in nature. And so you have that kind of hot, barren, open, wide open landscape in total contrast to his cluttered, very claustrophobic home life.
Yes, I got that contrast. Like, I really loved that, how he felt like the horde was overcoming him in the house, and that he had to go to this place to escape and be able to breathe. But then there's a point in the book where that place is under threat, like the place that he always goes, and you're like, oh no. I mean, I just have to tell you, like, I'm a grown-up.
You are?
I am a grown-up. And I read this book and I was like, what's going to happen? How is he possibly going to get out of this? Oh my goodness. I just was so, like the sense of danger was so high in so many places where you're like, wow. I was very, very impressed.
Well, I mean, this kid he's dealing with a lot of anxiety, and so I'm sort of glad that you felt that, because that I think makes you maybe empathize with the person who's dealing with a lot of anxiety or something, but something like that. Oh no, you know.
Yeah, and I think one of the kind of the themes that I picked up on this book is the notion of secret keeping, and how this, and for very good reasons, Colin is keeping all kinds of secrets from all kinds of people, and it's not like he's somebody who wants to keep secrets, but he feels that he has to. And I mean, how did you approach that? Like, this kid is lying to everybody around him, basically.
He is. He's ashamed of his home life. He's embarrassed. He's a middle schooler. Middle school is awkward enough without a lot of stuff going on at home. And I think one of the things that I wanted to show with him, especially in that secret keeping, is that I think he comes to realize that one of the ways is to reach out for help. Sometimes that's also one of the hardest things to do. And so, breaking through that kind of inclination to keep all those secrets, right? To keep everything so close to you and not let people help you. He has to kind of overcome that to survive the situation.
Yeah. And there's a point at which it seems like his secret has been revealed, and his friend is like, wow, that was a really crazy gag you pulled on your dad.
He thinks it's a prank, because he's a prankster, yeah.
And I was just like, what? That was a really rough moment for me, because I'm like, oh, his secret is out. And he's like, no, I actually have to say it out loud in order for somebody to understand what's going on. Which brings me to compulsive hoarding disorder. What kind of research, how did you find out about that, and how did you depict it so vividly in this book?
So research was a huge part of the beginning phases, and actually kind of ongoing through the book. There's a group right out of Boston actually that does a lot of research into hoarding disorder. So they published a lot of papers that I read. I also read a lot of memoirs written by children of hoarders, because I wanted to get that first-hand account, and reached out to Kimberly Ray Miller, who wrote memoir Coming Clean, and we communicated, and she also directed me to some online forums for adult children of hoarders who have kind of discussed their experiences. So I really wanted to get it right. I wanted it to be authentic and accurate and sensitive, and make sure that what I was showing wasn't wouldn't cause harm in any way. I was interested to learn when I was researching this that between 2 and 6% of the population struggle with compulsive hoarding disorder to some degree. So that's a lot higher than I realized, and a lot of those people affected are kids at home who have to learn to navigate the daily risk of physical and psychological harm. So I thought a lot about that. I was encouraged to see that in 2018, the WHO finally classified hoarding disorder as a medical condition, which means it's spurring a lot more research and outreach for yeah, I mean, I hope the book raises awareness and helps build community.
Yeah, well, I think that her dad is a very empathetic figure, and because he's brilliant, and it's clear that he loves his son, but it's also clear that he can't control this. And all the times that Colin says he cares more about that stuff than he does about me, and it's just, and that the poem that is about being hungry, I was like, oh my goodness, I can't even, like, as a mom, I was just like, no.
I know, I feel like he's a real child, like I feel like I love him, and you just want to reach through the book and give him a hug sometimes. And, yeah, and that was important for me to show to when, writing the father character especially, to show that he's loving and he's brilliant, but he's flawed, like any of us are, right? And to show that in spite of, what might be classified as a weakness or, this medical condition, he is a good father. He tries, he's loving, but he's imperfect.
And I also thought it was interesting that he had signs of this before his wife passed away. So that was the other thing that I thought was really interesting, is that he was kind of like this already, but he kind of had somebody in his life who, and then like once she was gone, and
the grief kind of spiraled down.
So he felt like a real character to me.
I'm so glad.
Yeah. Okay. Another question. The orange notebook.
Yes.
Was that always part of the story? And that was one
Look
of my
at the
favorite
design.
things.
Speaking of the orange notebook, the designers of Charles did such a cool job. I love the way they did that. But so the orange notebook is this notebook that Colin carries around. It has all these chapters for how to survive these, crazy circumstances. Many of them occur in the book as little excerpts here. So it's a different format, and they're sprinkled throughout the text strategically to kind of tie into the narrative. They occur at different points when, Colin might want to reference one, or when the advice in them can sort of be applied to what's happening in his life. So I had seen a long time ago, there is a book called Worst Case, like survival tips or something. And so this is a riff off that, but completely on my own construction. But I just thought as like an anxious boy, he might want this manual to reference, right? To kind of, it gives him comfort. And he's ready to be prepared. And it kind of became this thing. Some of them are playful, some of them are scary, some of them are just so outlandish and far-fetched that you're like, oh my gosh, like this would never happen. But he just, hangs on. Oh, I see. Andy, do you want to? You say zombies. Exactly. You already read that far? Oh, okay. Andy's in our book club, and he's like the most voracious reader.
That's so awesome. Yes, the zombies one. I love that one. But you know what? I will say this, and then I have one more question, and then we should open it up to people. But I will say that kind of notebook and memorizing the steps, that's really smart. That's kind of like what we do in medicine. We like memorize all the steps you have to do if there's an emergency, so when the emergency happens, you don't have to remember anything, you already have it in your head.
That's also a little bit of my personality on the page. I'm a worrier, I like to be prepared, and so that's like me to the extreme. Actually, that reminds me, on the kids kind of activity table back there, there's like poetry prompts and coloring pages. There's also little notebooks you're welcome to take there, intended to be best case scenario handbooks or notebooks, so help yourself to some of those if you want, just before you go. Thank you for reminding me.
Yes, good. And last question. So what do you hope readers take away from this book?
That's a great question. I hope readers take away, one, an interest in poetry, or just I hope it piques their interest in this verse novel format, which was so new to me just 6 years ago, and now it's an obsession. I love it, and I think it has so much potential. I hope, like I mentioned, that the book, builds some awareness and empathy around compulsive hoarding disorder and bullying and anxiety, and makes it, spurs some conversations in the classrooms or at home, and just brings kids hope. And that's all we can do
I just really, those 3 friends are just, I'm never going to forget them. So thank you for sharing this book with us. So does anybody else have any questions for Rebecca?
So thank you for doing this.
Thank you for coming.
It's my second time, so really
You
happy
came to
be
Kip's
back.
event, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yes, I remember you.
Yeah. So my question is related to this. So we're all going through the pandemic. So in terms of the timeline, was this book written before or during?
That's a good question. And actually, the publication got bumped due to the pandemic. So it, like I said, it was about 6 years in the making. It sold in, what was it, 2018, 2019, and then it went through multiple rounds of revision. So it was in production and pretty much done before the pandemic. So that the pandemic doesn't occur in here, but that would be something that he would be very worried about, and he would be washing his hands and masking up, I'm sure.
He would have a whole plan.
It's funny because that's actually one scenario that's not in this book. It's actually in Mission Multiverse. I wrote that draft before the pandemic, and there is this evil virus that the bad guys are inserting beneath the Earth's crust, and they're going to release into the world. And then my editor was like, "Uh-oh," you know, it was like life imitating art, and we were like, maybe we need to pull that plot point back a little so it's not getting too close to home. So, yeah.
How many poems?
Poems total that made it into the book. I mean, 300 something. I don't know the exact number, and some of them morphed and became. Some poems are very spare, like there's just a line. Some are a bit heavier, and some we had to kind of merge due to formatting because when we sent the book to design, when we thought the text was finished with my editor, it goes to design. And the book was like 500 pages long. And my editor was like, we don't have a budget for that. You need to figure out a way. You can't have one word on a page. Like, you're not Jason Reynolds. I don't have like a poem count per se. But there were many more that got cut and that got kind of reworked. And it was a really messy, involved revision process. So it's hard to say. But maybe 300-ish. Good question.
Can I sign my name on this?
Oh,
Number of pages to teach young adults to read?
that's a good question. We usually work in terms of like word count, and there's kind of like a ballpark, but it's, I think, at least my editor, Julie Livin at Charleswood, she always said like, you need to tell the story however it needs to be told. We can tweak things. I think if it was like 100,000 words and 500 pages, they would say that's not appropriate for this audience. There's an appetite for shorter middle grade, and then there's kids like Ambi and Penny and Olivia who are avid readers who love a big chunky book. Am I right? I mean, you guys like slide through books. So, there's so many different types of readers. I wouldn't send a project out on submission, which is when my agent shops it around to publishers. That was way out of whack with kind of the norm, but.
And even though this looks like a chunky book, there are many fewer words in this book than a prose novel would be of this size. So it's also like a much faster read than you think it's going to be.
Because there's so much white space. Yeah, it actually has like a low word count. Chip, do you have one?
I was just wondering, as an ex-mathematician, how did you come up with the Riemann hypothesis?
Google. I was like, fancy math problems involving prime numbers, and I was like, oh, and then I went down that whole rabbit hole. Yes.
So it was prime numbers that got you.
That was kind of the impetus, because that becomes like a theme, and so it's this unsolved hypothesis, and it was fascinating once I dove into it. But I didn't come to the story with that background knowledge. I have to thank my search engine for that. I wouldn't classify it as easy, but I don't think this ever went too dark, although I have a YA novel that is coming out in 2023 that's very dark, but YA is such a different beast because it's for much older readers, so we could go there, but I think then it would probably jump to YA. I mean, my protagonist is 12, so middle grade, which is what this is kind of the sweet spot, but anything above like 13 YA, young adult category.
I also think that, children are so resilient, right? Like they can deal with a lot,
Yeah.
but then you go through the kind of routine things that children do, which is like they go to school because they have to go to school. Then they go to like swim practice because they go, and so those things were kind of built into
That rhythm of the day.
the lives of the kids in this book, and it was, and he's got such good friends who have nice parents too,
Yeah,
which is also
parents-
super helpful.
Yeah, I know. I didn't want to have everyone dealing with so much stuff, right? He does work. Well, I think thank you so much. These were awesome questions. It was so good to chat. Thank you for your questions. Thank you guys all for coming so much. This is so awesome, and we're going to be hanging out. There's candy and cookies and all kinds of stuff. Please eat it. So otherwise, I'll bring it home and eat it. There are books, and Rajani's books. Her 6th this year are, I think, inside. You should really check out Red, White, and Whole. It is beautiful. It's also a verse novel that came out this year, and it's. I'm crossing my fingers that it gets some big attention this winter. But I don't want to jinx you.
What was already doing with book award.
Yes. Oh.
So how we're going to do this is, if you would like a copy of the book, Rebecca's going to be over here at the table signing. You can go get your book signed, personalize it, and then if you can bring it in the store and pay for it in the store after you've had it signed, that would be terrific. And once again, thank you all so much for coming. It is really great to see you all.